Politics has often been referred to as war by other means. To look at the political climate in many places today, that feels especially apt, given the levels of anger and resentment on display. But anger is not the same as resentment, ultimately, and understanding how they differ might be quite telling about the political forces seeking to sway the public. For their thoughts on this, we're joined in London, UK, by Teresa Capellos, Associate Professor of Political Psychology at the University of Birmingham. In Chicago, Illinois, Agnes Callard, Associate Professor in Philosophy at the University of Chicago. And in our nation's capital, journalist and author David Moscrop. And we're delighted to have the three of you with us on TVO tonight. I want to just set up our conversation by asking our director, Sheldon Osmond, to put this graphic up because we've got a bit of information we want to share. Gallup runs something called the Global Emotions Index. They do it in 122 countries. And according to its 2022 edition of Negative Experience Index, which consists of self-reported experiences of worry, stress, sadness, physical pain, and anger, it reached a 33 out of 100. 33. That is apparently the highest it has been since the measurement started in 2006, when it was just at 24. And if we focus on anger, 23% of those surveyed felt it. David, to you first. A Washington Post column of last year was entitled "Rage Has Poisoned Public Life in Canada," and you wrote, "We should distinguish between righteous and toxic anger." So let's do that. Draw the distinction for us, if you would.
I remember getting called into the principal's office in, I think it was 7th or 8th grade, and being told, "You're angry, kid." And that's okay. But what you do with that anger matters a great deal. And so you can distinguish, I mean, to be a little more precise about the effects of that anger. It can become productive. It can be channeled into, for instance, assessing the state of not just your own situation, but the sort of structural problems that developed in the first place. Or it can create a kind of backlash against other people. It can build solidarity and movement for change, or it can result in a kind of turning inwards and, as I mentioned, a lashing out, which, for instance, might lead to, let's say, occupying the capital city of a country and staying there for weeks. So it matters a great deal what kind of form that takes. And in the social media age, the digital media age, there's a sort of tendency by elites, political elites, media elites, business elites, to try to harness a lot of that anger for their own ends, which ends up producing lots of toxic outcomes. And I was worried a great deal that where we were, elites were corralling folks in very, very dangerous ways that were going to pay off in very, very dangerous outcomes.
Well, let me do a quick follow-up with you since you mentioned the January 6th insurrection. Are you saying left-wing anger good, but right-wing anger bad?
Well, I would say that as a market socialist, wouldn't I? I mean, but there isn't anything inherently right or wrong about left or right-wing anger, but I would say contemporary history, not so contemporary history as well, often bears out the case that there are forms of right-wing anger that are extraordinarily toxic, left-wing too, but on balance, they tend to manifest in very different ways, although not universally. I would still say the preponderance of right-wing anger has been more toxic and destructive than left-wing anger, but that's a whole different episode maybe.
Indeed. Teresa, you've been writing about resentment for quite a time. Somebody you quoted calls it a psychological dynamite that threatens democracy. Why do you think?
Yeah. So there is a difference between resentment and ressentiment, which is an even more toxic, more hateful kind of resentment. And it can be a dynamite because what it does is it disengages the individuals that are experiencing this emotional mechanism from their own reality, the reality that is causing the frustrations, the pain, the grievances that they are reacting emotionally to. So although grievances highlight the frustrations and the need to address them socially and politically, the emotional responses that come out of that context are not ones that are conducive to pro-social solutions. They lean towards more antisocial preferences, more antisocial behaviors, which in the end compromise and stall the progress that they seek to invite. So they are counterproductive for their own, but they are dynamite for society in a sense that they have this tendency to undo what is already there.
Agnes, let me put some of your words back to you and have you explain what you meant by them. Because you've written, there are two problems with anger. It is morally corrupting and it is completely correct. Okay, explain.
Yeah, so I think the distinction between good and bad anger, as it's been drawn by David and Teresa, has been forward-looking. What do you do with the anger? But another question is, where did the anger come from? That is, what are your reasons for being angry? And sometimes we genuinely have reasons for being angry. So like the good anger would presumably be the anger where you had a reason, you were in fact justified, wrong was committed against you. And the problem is that if you have such a reason, you have that reason forever. That is, if the fact that somebody treated you unjustly is a reason to be angry, that never changes because the fact can't change because you can't go back in time. And that means there's a certain kind of rationality to like holding on to grudges. And the rational structure that kind of naturally creates in your soul is one where the other person's bad becomes your good. And that's the motive of revenge. And so revenge is naturally born out of anger. It's a natural consequence of anger. It's how you see things when you see things from an angry point of view. And that point of view could well be justified. And the justification doesn't expire. That's the scary thing about anger.
Well, you've prompted a couple of things in my head. Number one, that old Irish expression, what's the point of a good grudge if you can't hold it forever? And the second, as I watched Teresa shaking her head, kind of reminds me of something that I discussed with Martha Nussbaum on this program many years ago. And let's play a clip from that, and then we'll pick up the conversation. Sheldon, if you would.
Anger is a pained response to what the person thinks of as a significant damage to that person's well-being that was wrongfully inflicted. Now, so far, so good. Lots of things meet that description, and it's good to notice wrongful damages when they occur. But then, what is added is that the angry person wishes and hopes that there will be some kind of payback. In other words, believes that the doer should suffer. Now that's where I think we stop making sense. But the gut reaction that says somebody's got to pay and I'm going to solve my anguish about this death by making that doctor pay, that is by itself an irrational reaction and it doesn't do any good. So I think that the anger that people feel comes from the fact that they just don't know how to solve the problem, and they'd rather not face the real problem. They'd rather just hit somebody over the head with a stick and then pretend that that helps to solve the problem.
Now, Agnes, that's your fellow Chicagoan saying that vengefulness or an eye for an eye doesn't solve the problem. What do you say to that?
I agree it doesn't solve the problem. But the question is it a rational response from the point of view of the person who has anger? And I think the answer to that is yes. And the way that you can see it is, I was having a discussion last night with journalist Liz Brunig, and one point of the conversation was parenting when your children get into a fight. And so the one child takes something away from the other, and the second child pulls the first child's hair. And the question is, do you treat them differently? And her approach is like, of course. I mean, the second child had a reason for pulling her sister's hair, namely, she'd had a dress snatched away from her. And so, I think that resonates with many people that, look, she wasn't unprovoked, which is to say the bad thing she did was provoked. The bad thing becomes a good thing because it was a response to another bad thing. In many contexts, we find that very intuitive. But when we really don't like the bad things people are doing, all of a sudden we get really alienated from the point of view of identifying with their anger. And we're like, that's bad. It's unproductive. It's always unproductive. It's unproductive even in the case of the little kid pulling your sister's hair. But it's also very intuitive.
Teresa, you were shaking your head earlier. You want to come back on that?
It's a very complicated topic, the one we're discussing. It's so interesting, all the little angles and the nuances and how we understand emotions. We talk about what is rational. Well, when we're describing anger, we should be thinking about emotional, affective, rather than rational. Rational is more the decision-making, a process of reaching a decision. But here now, at the essence of it, we talk about emotion. So we should be talking about affect rather than rationality. But what I think it is also important for us to distinguish is the impact of an emotion. Does it have an antisocial outcome or a prosocial outcome? And if you don't want to go as far as the outcome, we can think of intention. Is it an antisocial intention or a prosocial intention? Now, what's going on with revenge? If revenge is part of a desire to spoil, spoiling is not a characteristic of anger, it's a characteristic of envy. So although we could be talking about anger, and we could have this public conversation about who is angry, does anger contribute to the solution of society or not, at the end of the day, what people express as anger, what we are used to be identifying as anger, can be concealing other deeper affective states that can be painful: frustration and envy, guilt, shame, inefficacious anger as well. And what we have seen, and with the first poll that you showed us when we started this conversation, is this license to be expressing anger in today's society in a way, and there's benefits to that. It's good to be able to recognize emotions and talk about them, find the words and express them, but it's also really, so in a way, when you recognize an expression, when you ask somebody how do you feel, they can very quickly tell you, I'm angry. Now, does that mean that that's the only thing that they feel? Probably not. Does it mean that they have a word to put for the emotion that they're experiencing? Yes, it does. But for us, in political psychology and psychology as well, it is our responsibility to dig a little deeper and get to the bottom, the essence of that emotion. Is it just anger, or are people identifying themselves as angry because there is a public debate about anger, because anger has become very popular as part of the populist political scene, but effectively what they are feeling and what we see them feeling when we study that anger a little deeper is a little bit more nuanced. In some cases, guilt, in some cases, shame, in some cases, envy. And envy is associated with a desire to spoil. So,
well, let me jump in there for a second and put that to David, because this notion of let's make them pay, justified or not, David?
Well, the feeling is certainly justified insofar as it's a legitimate response to stimuli. We like to think of ourselves in terms of an Enlightenment legacy, right? We're rational, dispassionate, calculative machines. I wrote about this in my book. We're told that we are these we have this Enlightenment legacy of moving through the world and taking raw sensory data and compiling it and evaluating it as one might look at a spreadsheet, and then coming to some sort of ideal conclusion and then going forward with that, which is just absolute nonsense, right? It's just not how we really operate in the real world. We can try to approximate that, and sometimes we can get pretty close. Some people are pretty good at it. But we are fundamentally characterized by emotion. Emotion tends to be in the driver's seat. We spend a lot of time operating on the sort of fast, intuitive responses to the world around us, especially in a complicated world which is extraordinarily fast and difficult to navigate. And so, in a sense, we've created a world, developed a world, accidentally fallen bum backwards into a world that is almost feels like it's custom built to elicit angry responses and let us challenge them channel them into the world really, really quickly. Think of social media. So of course that makes a lot of sense, but as has been noted absolutely correctly, it's not super productive, right? In fact, it's deeply counterproductive. And anyone who's ever lashed out at someone and taken a moment to reflect on it might have thought, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. And now the problem's worse. And now what I'm going to do, or now we're into, the Hatfields and McCoys, and we know how counterproductive that becomes.
Well,
all
Agnes,
that to me makes good sense, but it doesn't produce anything good.
Sure. Agnes, let me circle back to some comments that David made about the January 6 participants, if I can call them that. And I think it's fair to say some of those folks are resentful because they are not completely enamored with the amount of multiculturalism happening in your country or the amount of feminism happening in your country, or the notions of fluid sexual orientations and this kind of thing. In your judgment, what should we think about people who have huge problems with all of that?
So I think that Teresa was making a really good point about the thought that in some cases, anger is sort of epiphenomenal. It's like a flare up of something, and there's something more fundamental lying below it. And I think she used the word ressentiment to characterize that. And you could think of that as a kind of disposition, a stable underlying disposition to feel anger, where the anger, like, I think, if your heart rate isn't rising or something, it's not really anger, right? Anger has a pretty recognizable profile. But you could have this underlying resentment. And then what that does is it disposes you to find things to be angry about, to find occasions for anger. And I also think that she's right that I really like the word license that she used. So I think that somehow we feel these days like we have a lot of license to find occasions for anger, specifically in public spaces. So I think it's probably not an accident that insurrection was in this kind of very public space. But social media is another kind of public space where it's almost like you could think of it as a desecration of the public space. Like it's a free-for-all. None of us would behave like that with our family, with our loved ones. We wouldn't just like wantonly get angry at them, even if we were in a bad mood. You can be in a bad mood and you might lash out at your spouse, but then you'd be like, I'm sorry. You wouldn't let it overtake you in that way. So I guess that's the general analysis I would give. I don't feel like I have more of a good particular grip on what was motivating that specific set of people. So I don't feel like I'm in a position to diagnose them.
Okay, well, David, let me go to you and ask whether, we need to treat people with respect and we need to treat their feelings seriously. But are we able to dismiss as irrational some of the views of those who, for example, stormed Capitol Hill in Washington?
Well, it depends on whose rationality we're talking about. You can behave in what to you seems like a rational way, while an external observer would say that makes no sense to me and seems utterly irrational. Because you're coming from a different place, you have a different set of facts, quote unquote facts, by the way, even facts are facts, but to someone who believes them, there is no distinction because they believe them, right? There might be a broader distinction that's socially determined, but for them, they deeply, deeply believe it, then what they're doing is rational. And that's part of what is so thorny about political decision making is that if we're operating in different worlds, in different realities, based on different facts, based on different motivations, who are listening to different media folks who are telling us different quote unquote truths, then what seems reasonable and rational to one set will seem utterly irrational and unreasonable to another. And the process of politics is the process of figuring out how we live together despite that, and hopefully in a better situation trying to come to broad agreement about the world so we can minimize a lot of that friction. So I would say, looking at them, I thought there's a deep politics of resentment on the American right that has long been fostered deliberately by people for different reasons. It exists in Canada too. I think that's a kind of deep resentment-driven politics that is irrational in the sense that the grievances aren't reasonable. But to them, it certainly seems that way, that it is. So, what are you going to do about that? That's the ultimate question, is what are you going to do about that? And to sort of say, well, you're just a bunch of idiot bumpkins, you're a basket of deplorables, it doesn't do it. And I think that's one of the, especially on the left, something we've got to reckon with in the contemporary world, is that simply dismissing these folks as, angry rubes isn't going to do it. It doesn't work.
Hillary's never going to get over saying basket of deplorables, is she?
I probably shouldn't.
Gotcha. Okay, Teresa, reactionary feelings, are they worth less than progressive feelings, particularly when you look at what happened on Capitol Hill that day?
We have reactionary feelings, and I've been writing on reactionism for a while, so it's interesting to try to unpick what that is. But we also have radical feelings, and we have retrogressive feelings, and progressive feelings, and conservative feelings. So we think we're dealing with two opposites, but it's more of a well-rounded account of how you could be thinking of political orientations as harboring a particular affective profile. So there is an interesting similarity between the affective content of extreme politics, whether they sit on the left or they sit on the right. And what we find is that this desire to undo the present and move towards something else is very often motivated by resentment. But that's not necessarily ressentiment. It's not the sour and toxic grievance that we see played out in politics very often in the more retrogressive parts of the electorate that want to turn things back, but they are not willing to work for it. Reactionaries, so perhaps I'm introducing a lot of complexity to this conversation, but reactionaries and radicals do not have a very good relationship with the present. They want to undo the present in a very abrupt and often violent way. But what they like to do is either turn things back, reactionary orientation, or move things forward to an unknown future, radical orientation. But you have other spaces in between in these orientations. You could think of the retrogressive citizens who are not comfortable with the present. They are not conservatives. They don't like things to stay as they are. They want to move things back, but their desire for acting, for change, is inhibited by their emotional experiences, which is, in essence, resentimentful, which is passively angry, dormantly endorsing violence, sometimes engaging with it, but not actively going out there seeking it. You could be part of a movement by accident without you being the one organizing it. Now, that is a characteristic of a really particular emotional mechanism that takes your envy, your shame, your inefficacious anger, and converts it into resentment. So resentment could be what you see at the output of it, but the process is a really particular process that is very painful and involves what we identify as a transvaluation, a change of the value. And this is really interesting, because when we talk about emotions or when we talk about ideologies, when we talk about anger, you wouldn't expect to be witnessing this process of the change of values, of the things that you desire, which you cannot attain, which into something that then you put aside as worthless, as not desirable anymore. So this devaluation of what was initially desired, the unattainable is devalued, and the sense of self, from being an individual that doesn't get what that individual wants, an individual that perceives themselves as at the margins of society, perhaps a loser, changes their own perception of their self into a pious and moral victim. And that moral victimhood is the sign, the clear sign that we're not dealing with anger. We're dealing with resentment.
Okay, let me pick up on that and take that to David, because David, I want to pick up on something you wrote in one of your columns in the Washington Post, where you wrote, "In a democracy, reactionary grievance politics that produces violence should be intolerable." Okay, explain why.
Well, because by the time you've reached that, you can no longer get together and decide how we ought to live together. It's sort of saying like, well, we're going to bargain about how we want to run the house, but I'm going to hold a gun to your head. And then let's have a chat about how we want to, who's going to take out the garbage, right? I mean, like you can't bargain under those situations, because no longer are you recognizing the other person sitting across from you as a person who has moral equal worth, in a democracy in which we self-govern, more or less self-govern. That's a different episode, and again, about how little we actually self-govern. But let's just say, for the purposes here, that we have self-government. Well, then we can't do it, right? And so by the time someone's occupying the Capitol or occupying Ottawa, in a convoy, you've sort of passed the point of democratic politics, and you've entered something else. Although I'll put a little bit of a caveat there. There are moral moments in which that is necessary. Think of the civil rights movement in the United States and some of the more radical elements of that. Those were necessary for breaking a wall that wasn't going to be broken with democratic deliberation. right, which I happen to quite like, but there's some moments where you don't. But this is where we have to sort of click off the liberal intuition that's embedded so deeply in each of us and say some things are substantially different than others. And we need to distinguish between, say, that kind of manifestation when it's in battle of for civil rights for racialized folks and people who don't want to get a vaccine. Right. So we have to make those substantive distinctions, which itself is a democratic social process that we have to go through. But by the time people have become violent for bad reasons, democracy has broken down to the point where it has to be stopped and better institutions have to be reasserted.
In which case, Agnes, let me get your take on the, I don't know, roughly 20 or 30% of the population in both your country and mine that have developed reactionary, anti-modern feelings. They are angry at the world. A world which doesn't seem to care very much about what they think about various things. What's your take on that?
Okay, so I guess as a philosopher, I distinguish practical questions from theoretical questions. But maybe one of the really distinctive features of public life is people are always trying to make decisions they can't make in a public way. Like, here's what we should do, even though that isn't going to be done by your saying it. And so it often confuses me. But I think there is stuff we can do individually. That is, you can individually talk to the people you can talk to. And there's a question, how do you interact with someone if they're expressing resentful sentiments? How do you talk to such a person? How do you talk to such people on Twitter? Right. So those are actual situations we can encounter. There isn't I don't think there's some immediate lever we can press at a governmental level where we do something to those people, right? That's just that's not an option that's on the table. So from my point of view, there's no point in deliberating what we should do when we can't do anything. But I guess I think that the best I've been able to find is to interact with people inquisitively, and to see whether there is anything that you have to learn from them. And people are pretty receptive to other people having that approach. And they're pretty resistant to people who have the approach of, without at all thinking that I might have something to learn from you, let me teach you a bunch of things about how you're on.
That feels like very good advice. Less than 5 minutes to go here. Let's see if we can get a couple of more things on the table. Therese, I'll come to you on the issue of resentment because you have studied that in Greece. You live currently in the United Kingdom. Do individual cultures express resentments differently?
Yes, there's always, emotions are always culturally embedded, right? So they are experienced, they are expressed, they are recognized, and they're acted out, or they are performed differently in different cultures. But our role as political psychologists, social scientists, is to trying to understand the commonalities across cultures. Of course, understanding the nuance in different places. Cultures are not just the only thing of the story. It's also the social political environment, the context, which is not just about culture, is what's going on at a particular place at a given point in time. And at the time we were studying ressentiment in Greece, that was during the financial crisis. And so it was a really pressurized crisis environment, and we were really interested in understanding how people respond to this. And we've also looked at similar pressurized environments in the United Kingdom around the Brexit time, where there were different kinds of grievances. But what we found, which was similar, and in the US, where we looked at data there, but what we found across these different political and cultural systems, they call them like that, is that there was a common response to politics, which was to deal with politics through grievance. So expressing grievances, identifying grievances, looking at politics as the place of grievance was the similarity that we saw across these three contexts. And that got us thinking that perhaps a very new phenomenon that we are encountering is that of grievance politics, which is approaching political debate, political disagreement, political frustrations from a grievance perspective, which immediately puts the other as your opponent, immediately, not an opponent that you want to debate in a deliberative democracy fashion, but as somebody that you want to eliminate, to dominate. So there's a really interesting particular way of engaging with the social relationships that constitute democratic politics. And what David was saying before is linked to this, that once you start dealing with anybody else as somebody that is out to get you, somebody who has pushed you out, or somebody who has taken away what is rightfully yours, and you could do this either in real locales or online, then you start engaging with people in a really particular emotional tone. And that is not a tone that can provide pro-social outcomes.
Right. Let me save a minute here. We're down to our last minute. Let me save it for David, because you're here in Canada, but you're right about Canada for an American publication. So I wonder if have you come to any conclusions about whether we're becoming more like them?
I think Canada is becoming slightly more polarized. There's some data on this. Edelman has a trust barometer, and they look at polarization, and the data was fairly interesting, is that Canada is shifting to a more toxic polarized. There's nothing inherently wrong with being polarized. Toxic polarization is different. We're becoming less trusting as well. And I rushed to add this because we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but there's also a class dimension to this that is utterly central to understanding a lot of this, and that there's a huge class divide. And that when you break down a lot of the data and the numbers, you do see a class divide on things, for instance, like trust, and that's significant as well. And I do think we have been insulated against some of it, in part because of our national institutions, some cultural bits, and some social programming, which helps a lot. But I do worry that that's eroding, and that we're moving towards a more toxic, polarized environment. The old cliche is that we're sort of 10 years behind America. It's not a bad heuristic, and probably there's something to it in this case.
Gotcha. David Moskrob, Agnes Callard, Teresa Capellos, we thank all three of you for coming on to TVO tonight and having this most interesting conversation. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.